Welcome to our on-demand webinar measuring biopharma confidence, raising capital on mergers and acquisitions. I'm Lindsay Johnson, part of the team here at Worldwide Clinical Trials. We've worked with Kineticos Life Sciences to survey top executives from biopharmas to create a confidence index and quantify sentiments about our industry. For Q1 of 2020, we've been conducting discussions on key findings with industry experts. Don't forget to check out our first and second webinars in this series as well. Now here's Philip, who will be moderating this next discussion. Enjoy!
I want to thank everyone again for joining us today for our third in our series of weekly panel discussions covering the Q1 edition of the 2020 Biopharma Confidence Index, or BCI, co-sponsored by Kineticos Life Sciences and Worldwide Clinical Trials. The BCI is intended to be a forward-looking index designed to measure C-suite and executive leadership sentiment in the biopharma industry. We look for the BCI to become a valuable and highly sought-after resource for its key insights across both key industry-related issues and critical business functions. I want to start today by thanking our four panelists joining us. We have Peter Benton from Worldwide Clinical Trials, who is returning from our first panel discussion. So thank you for being here, Peter.
Thank you.
Kevin Hampton, Senior Vice President of Biopharma at Kineticos.
Glad to be back.
Tom Zetlow, who's one of our operating executives for Kineticos.
Yep, glad to be here. Thank you.
And finally, Dan McCormick, Senior Vice President of Biopharma at Kineticos.
Thank you, Philip.
I'm Philip Galinas, Chief Commercial Officer for Kineticos, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. Over this quarter, we'll be delivering 5 panel discussions covering 5 specific sections of the BCI. With our first discussion panel, we covered the fundamental elements of running a biopharmaceutical. The second panel, we covered the impact of new technologies and new approaches to the market. Our third panel today will discuss raising capital and mergers and acquisitions. Section 4, which we'll cover next, will combine CRO outsourcing and licensing activities. And finally, Section 5 will deal with sales and marketing concepts. Also, we'll cover political pressures and overarching economic effects. The data we're sharing today is based on a total of 112 respondents and sharing only those respondents who acknowledged a confidence level of 8 and above related to a scoring scale of 1, meaning no confidence or not important, up to 10, which was high confidence or highly important. So let's get started. Our first set of charted data and questions are about those companies who list capital markets as high importance and compared to the same respondents responding to their high confidence in the capital markets themselves. So looking at this data, all the companies understand and seem to have responded that the importance of capital in such a capital-intensive industry. Interesting that larger public companies have less confidence in the capital markets in the next 12 months than the other respondents. So my question, Peter, in your experience, how much do capital markets directly impact how we engage companies as a CRO? And second, Kevin, as a consultant, during positive market conditions? And how do we make sure we're supporting our clients as they consider both funding activities and best use of available funds? Can we explain why startups and private companies might be more optimistic than the mid-size and larger companies? And then finally, we can come back to this, but I'll go ahead and put it out there. Could we see this changing due to changing political climate in regions such as the U.S. elections that are upcoming, the Brexit situation in Europe, re-escalation of trade relationships? Is there anything to be concerned about with the coronavirus? And then finally, I know this is a lot, but how should we respond if there is a downturn? And how can we help our clients prepare and respond if there's a downturn?
Sure, thanks. It certainly makes sense that the importance is much higher in a startup, or I guess the private company is about the same as some of the other larger ones. But the importance of capital is extremely important to startups. And I think their confidence, again, we were on the third year of a wave of significantly increased investment in biotech and biopharma startups. So people are very confident in the funding environment. These are typically entrepreneurs, so I think they're probably overly optimistic to start with. Otherwise, they wouldn't be starting a company or starting a business. So I think you would expect that to be the case. And it's hard to predict political turmoil, coronavirus, trade wars, whatever else it may be. It's tough for me to see that any of those things makes a global impact on the funding for life sciences. I think there's a lot of money out there to invest. There are a lot of new therapeutic areas, new treatments, stem cells, gene therapies, you name it. So I'm pretty bullish long term on the overall market. And again, a major market correction would affect things, but I think most of these biotechs honestly have raised money when times are good and will be able to weather the storm for several years if there were to be some sort of short-term market intervention.
Thank you, Peter. Kevin, anything to add to that? Your thoughts on this?
The first question was directed at how can we engage companies as consultants and CROs, depending on what the capital markets look like. And I guess quickly to that point, from my perspective, when capital markets are good, their companies tend to think more long term. What do we do next? Not only what are we doing right now? And that's an opportunity for groups like Peter's at Worldwide Clinical Trials and Kineticos to get involved and really help people think about long-term strategies. And when they're bad, what I've seen is or when they're not as favorable in terms of capital markets, they're more looking at what can they do today to increase the value, and they're a little more narrow focus. So as long as we can understand and adapt the services and the advice that we can provide based on those two dynamics, I think that's helpful. I was thinking similarly along the lines of Peter with my next two comments. Number one, these people are entrepreneurial in nature. They're confident just by nature. So I think that's something certainly to consider. Private and startups certainly are probably in that aspirational and hopeful mode if they haven't tapped into the capital markets. But once a company gets in there and lives or dies by that market, they might have a different outlook on it. And Peter took the words right off my paper in terms of weathering the storm. I don't see a huge impact with any of those factors, Philip, that you mentioned. Yes, it could dip, but I think weathering the storm is probably a great analogy for that. So I think, like I said, there could be a dip, but I don't think it's going to be anything that will impact pharma biotech too much. And then I guess finally, real quick to end, in terms of a downturn, I think the best advice we can give as consultants is to tell a company to fail fast rather than fail slow. We do a lot of work where we look at assets and help determine which ones to bring forward and which ones to maybe deprioritize. And again, the best, most valuable, but sometimes toughest advice is if we don't see compelling science or their commercial opportunity is not really there, then better to kill that program earlier than late. So that's kind of, I hope I addressed all the questions there, Philip.
No, I think you did a great job, and I did see something in the news this morning talking about some of the current issues that are affecting the markets. And one of the things it was saying, even if coronavirus is having some substantial downturn in what the current markets look like, not specifically capital markets, but there's too much data out there that would suggest that this will be a short-lived downturn and that the overall markets are solid, but more importantly, the demand for what we do as far as the development of drugs and the demand out there to provide for the unmet needs for the patient populations that these companies are trying to address is there. So I think you guys are right that these guys understand the markets they're in and understand how to weather these short-term issues and to move forward. So very insightful. Thank you, guys. Anything from Dan or Tom to add?
This is Tom. Just quickly, I think it's interesting. Peter talked about the number of good years that we've had for raising capital. And I think we saw that in some earlier data we've talked about how these smaller companies are going worldwide in their clinical trials rather than, kind of jumping into the market with both feet rather than going one region at a time. So I think that all these things are interrelated, right? Capital markets, where you're doing clinical trials, indications you're going for. It's a very complex market, and I think it's really important for the smaller companies as they do this to have really good partners as they go forward in these different areas.
The only other comments that I would add, I think everybody's covered off on all the key points from my perspective, along the lines of relative importance of capital to the startups versus those that are on the market. Not surprising what we see here. Kind of to your question, Philip, about political pressures, et cetera, those companies, small to mids, that are launching or have marketed products, they're less concerned about raising the capital. What their number one priority is driving revenue growth. So any mounting political pressures that might get in the way of that or potentially impact pricing and access, that's right out in front and of top priority to address.
So I just wanted to build on Tom talking about the expertise needed in those capital markets. I think it's important that startup companies understand where they can drive value from a company like Kineticos or Worldwide and really get a broader perspective, not as narrowly focused as their individual target, but really getting a broad focus of what's going on in the marketplace, both from a commercial value perspective and then understanding how they're going to execute a trial to get the data they need to get a label to realize that commercial value. And again, I think it's incumbent and extremely important that they get early advice about the marketplace that they're going to go after and the way in which they're going to go get approval for a treatment or drug in that space.
Thank you, Peter. That's a great additional insight. Why don't we move on to the second set of data? And here what we asked and what we charted was data around questions regarding anticipated change in the number of new IPOs over the next 12 months. What we see is just overall that there is expectation that the perceived market for IPOs will pick up somewhat in the next 12 months. So with that said, just questions about, well, how do we see ourselves supporting these expectations from a CRO, clinical and regulatory landscape and issues? Do we see a shift in how we deal with clients who are asking us to support them if they're in that IPO mode? And then again, just how do we support those expectations as consultants and a CRO with companies who are looking forward or toward that IPO? Peter, you want to start us off?
Obviously, we're not involved in the actual IPO process itself, but I think in ensuring that they really designed and executed a very robust trial design and that operational clinical execution is very well thought out. I think helping them really understand the data sets that are produced from the trial. It's rare, but it does happen that we've supported them with either not fundraising directly, but certainly have supported them in investor presentations or kind of backup from a market perspective, from a therapeutic or regulatory path of insight, have certainly supported some of the meetings with investors in the past. Again, most investors have some pretty sophisticated clinical operations and regulatory people on their side. Certainly we've seen that. And then, it's actually more common that we do support folks with FDA interactions and really helping them prepare for this asset, which is fundamental to their IPO and to their evaluations as they go forward.
From my perspective, I'll keep it pretty simple here. I think the data we're looking at here in terms of a lot of people thinking, 10 to 20% increase of IPOs in the next 12 months is pretty consistent than what we've seen, certainly in the last 3 years. I think I went back and dug up some numbers, and there was 44 IPOs, healthcare IPOs in 2017, 58 in 2018, 68 in 2019. So slower growth from 2018 to 2019 was still in that 10 to 20% range. So I have no reason to believe that that's going to slow down. So I think our respondent pool may be thinking along the same lines. And I guess a bit contrary to what Peter said in terms of them not being able to get too terribly involved when they go through IPOs, that's an opportunity for a consultancy like Kineticos to really help these companies put themselves in a position of strength as they go out to the market and really putting that story together and adding it to that IPO prospectus. Those are all opportunities for Kineticos to add value as our clients are going through the process.
Kevin, is there anything specific that you feel like when we're working with companies around this IPO that when they come and ask that we feel like are critical components of how to prepare that we help them make that happen? That I don't want to say it's a short sight on their part, but it's definitely something that we know is critical to get ready for that IPO. Just an idea would be, the commercialization strategy or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean that's part of it, right? Typically, though, you'll need a very robust market analyses in your IPO prospectus, and those are the types of things that I would expect a biotech to look to an external support on something like that with deep expertise in whatever their therapeutic area is. From a commercialization perspective, it's kind of leading up to an IPO. That's why companies talk about IPOs 2-3 years before they actually plan on it, because you have to start planting seeds early on the commercialization factor. I think you have to tell the market you're prepared to commercialize. There are some companies up there with no intent to actually do so, but if you're thinking about an IPO, you want to get the highest valuation, I think you have to tell the market you're prepared to do so. And then if someone comes along and writes a big check, of course, you change your messaging. But I think anything on that commercial strategy and portfolio, kind of strategy are a couple key things that we can help with.
I do think sometimes we can help broaden a customer's perspective on the value that they can create. And I think when Kevin mentioned the commercial aspects, we talked about it a couple panels ago about real world evidence and people incorporating, patient reported outcomes and really focused on the value creation in studies. And that bridge between medical affairs, which is usually post-launch and more commercial activity, versus doing that in clinical for very little additional spend and funding, you can certainly create some significant additional value in really understanding how this drug is going to be used, reimbursed, and the value that it creates in the marketplace. I think that's different than it was a few years ago. I think the other thing that both Kineticos and Worldwide can do is to things like basket studies and other broader approaches to trying to collect data and trying to run trials within trials. Sometimes you can get more than one outcome from a trial by being a little creative in how you do it. Typically, in a startup, you want to really focus on one thing and go at it as fast as you can. But we do see some people are able to get a broader set of objectives accomplished with very little incremental dollars.
Guys, we're going to move to our third set of data or questions. We asked questions about our respondents' expected change in the valuation of biopharma companies in the public stock market in the next 12 months. So this question again goes back to Peter and Kevin to start off with. Do public market returns and expectations change behavior of biopharma companies relative to how they approach clinical trial plans, where they actually had those clinical trials planned as far as geographies? And then how does private funding expectations change behavior of biopharma companies relative to clinical trials, that geography? Anything around that?
When I look at this data, obviously some folks are bullish on the market, some people are bearish on the market. I've likened our industry to a little bit of a casino, right? I mean, not everybody's winning all the time, and there's so much that goes into bringing a drug to market. Technical risk, regulatory risk, market risk, competitive risk. No one ever really knows all the answers as to, is this really a good idea? And of course, there's all sorts of, forget about just the human interaction of a treatment with a patient, but just the regulatory changes around the world, regulatory risk of change across the world, execution issues or problems with the trial being executed. So it's incumbent upon someone to do the best job they can, get all of the expertise and skills they can from companies like Kineticos and Worldwide, and make sure they've got the best assumptions. But I've said it before, every assumption we make is wrong. It's the best that we can make with all the data we have available, but this is a highly unpredictable business. And so which drug is going to be successful? And if you do get it approved, is it going to be commercially viable and successful? Those are a lot of unknowns. And so I think looking at that distribution of confidence tells you that nobody really knows the answers, right? Everybody's hoping that they've got the right combination, the right plan, but I'm not sure they can predict that.
building off that, Peter, regardless if we're talking about public markets or private markets, I mean, the money's out there. I think we would all agree on that. And while some of these companies are pulling in tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, I think we all have to realize that burn rate is so high for some of these companies. That money is only going to last so long. So making sure that not only partners like Kineticos and Worldwide Clinical Trials, but making sure that their scientific advisory board is being leveraged, their executive team is a seasoned veteran. So I think just making sure that we equip them with all the best resources from a partnering perspective, and from a management team perspective is critical. I think from a private perspective, just then I'll close, is similar to the increase in IPOs. We're still seeing strong signs of growth in the public sector, right? With all the money being invested from VC and private equity. I think as far as the valuations go in the private sector, it's about coming to the table with your own assessment and your own valuation. It's really negotiating at its highest level and highest impact. It's just about putting data and facts behind that to build confidence in whoever's investing.
So what we looked at in the fourth set of questions and the charted data, this is all about respondents' anticipated change in M&A activity over the next 12 months. What we see is a pretty optimistic outlook on merger and acquisition activity in biopharma space for the next year. So how does such optimistic expectations of merger and acquisition and then the actual M&A activities itself alter our relationships with these companies? Does M&A optimism impact the way that we do or should consult, the way that we engage the client, and does it in fact actually impact or affect the way that we engage and work with clients as a CRO? Peter, you want to start off on the CRO side? We'll jump back to Kevin after.
Sure. From our perspective, I'm not sure the M&A market affects things other than, again, I think making sure you've got the right target market. You've really done a good market assessment. You've kind of looked at the valuations. You've designed a trial property. You're using the most efficient use of capital to get the data set that you want. I think all of these companies are looking for moving their valuation forward, looking for an inflection point, trying to create meaningful endpoints in their data. And again, I feel a little repetitive, but I think the real world evidence and looking at commercial aspects in clinical is something that we see a lot more of. I'd say probably starting in the mid-size companies. The smaller companies maybe can't afford to spend the additional dollars, but that's certainly an area that I think they can create more value for their business. And that, of course, I think drives some of that M&A activity.
I think it's just a matter of if they're looking at M&A, it's just what's in front of them at the point in time. I mean, there's a whole myriad of activities that need to get done as you prepare for M&A. Like Peter said, making sure that you are in a position, the value of the organization is at an inflection point. I mean, there's some companies out there that, talking about on the sell side, that have no interest in selling out early in phase one. They want to get to their next value creation point, perhaps when they get that phase one data, and that's when. And then there's others that early on are willing to sell out. So I think just making sure that understanding where each of these companies are. I mean, again, we help more on the sell side than on the buy side, but regardless of if you're on the sell side or on the buy side, if you're talking about M&A, you need to have a comprehensive understanding of the market dynamics, the competitive landscape, the real world evidence. Obviously, a lot of our work revolves around talking to payers and physicians to understand those dynamics. I think there's a whole set of activities that we can help with, but I don't know if it's their behaviors. It's just what's in front of them at that current point in time.
And this might feed into some of what Kevin was talking about and even Peter, but as we look into the next set of data, the fifth set, we actually broke this down and started talking about, well, what is happening within that M&A activity? What are the top reasons that companies are out there looking and considering merger and acquisition? So the first charted data were questions about our respondents' top reasons for merger and acquisition activity, or the top three reasons. And then we went on to the bottom chart represents the number one reason that our respondents are looking at M&A activity. So it's obvious to see, and you would expect this, clearly the prime goal of M&A activity is to acquire pipeline assets, to actually beef up that pipeline, drive both top line and bottom line growth for the business. But there is some opportunity here shown in the data that there is diversification through looking to acquire new technology and potentially access into new markets or new indications also seem to be important. So, Kevin, going to ask you to start here and then maybe have Peter jump in after. Do these responses fit with your experience supporting M&A with our clients? How best do we support clients with these efforts, but especially when there is that acquiring new technology, looking at new indications or new markets? How do we address the learning curve for these biopharmas? And how important is it for a consultant, but also a CRO partner, to work closely with their clients, their biopharma clients, as they move into these new spaces, whether that be an indication or moving into a new market or location?
A couple things here. Good questions, Philip. If I step back, maybe segment companies into two buckets here in terms of, on the buy side, looking to bring assets in and talking about that learning curve. I think there are more established companies out there that are focused only in oncology or only in neuroscience, right? And when I say more established, I mean more established biotech. Certainly big pharmas out there wanting to diversify, but I think the world that I've lived in and I live in now are more on the biotech side, where we're talking about a portfolio of, 6, 7 clinical programs, somewhere in that range. And I think the more established ones want to stick to what they know. And some of the earlier ones, maybe they have 1, 2, or 3 assets in there. They're fine being opportunistic as long as they feel that there's value in whatever they're looking at. So I think there's a couple mindsets there with early stage biotech, and the learning curve is going to be much greater for those that are opportunistic and willing to pull in a CNS asset if they're a metabolic company and so on and so forth. And I think you either have to develop that expertise internally or you can go out and buy it. And I know, Peter, you've mentioned something to me in the past regarding how into your strategy in terms of, you guys get into area, if you don't have the expertise, you just go out there and find the best talent and quote unquote buy the talent. So I think that's something to think about. And then I guess another thing on diversification, I most often see people diversifying on stage of development more so than therapeutic area. I've had a lot of CEOs and executives say, we need to fill a revenue gap in 2 to 3 years, right? So they have late stage assets and they're going to get to market, but their early stage is lacking, or vice versa. They're phase 1, but they're looking to get to market quicker, so they're looking to get ahead. So I see diversification on both sides. And as long as we understand what their corporate objectives and their corporate strategy are, I think there are different ways that we can help move them along.
Peter, anything to add to that from how you guys handle companies moving in? Well, first, obviously, just new assets, but moving into new technology or areas.
We probably don't see the companies that are looking to acquire technology or new production capabilities or something. I think it's those pipeline assets. And I think, as Kevin said, we see people that are, I'm a CNS company or a pain company, and I'm interested in potentially buying other pain assets. I think there's a mixture of different clientele. We have a lot of biopharma companies who really are focused in one specific area, one drug, one target area, and they'll just go after that until they create some value, and then maybe some line extensions and kind of surround it with some other additional IP. We have some successful biotech companies that have done that very well and then realize, okay, it's time to go now add another asset and expand their portfolio further. But as Kevin said, there's some companies that are, they're really just there to kind of take it from either out of phase 1 clinic and into the marketplace to phase 2, just get it to a certain point and then flip it before phase 3. There's a variety of companies, but their strategy for why they're acquiring the assets may be different, but that's certainly the primary thing we see is people are looking for additional assets, additional opportunities for them to execute their value creation strategy.
Very good. In the last set of data, what we asked questions about and charted the data was about our respondents' top 3 reasons for M&A activity, but this was by company type, looking to see if there was any difference in how startups, private, and our medium to large accounts actually looked at their top reasons for merger and acquisition activity. If you look at this from all company types, no surprise, acquiring pipeline assets remains the most important reason. Larger companies didn't seem to have as much a need to acquire more production or to use merger and acquisition to expand globally, probably viewing that their current facilities and operations were adequate. But interesting that larger companies view M&A more for entering into new markets and indications versus smaller companies. Anyway, the question to the panel is it your experience in supporting M&A activities from both sides of the acquirer and the acquired? Is it surprising that there's little difference in reasons for M&A activity among the biopharma types, other than that large pharma doesn't seem to be looking for production and other needs around M&A for global expansion, while the smaller companies seem to be very focused on growing their footprint in their existing area of expertise?
Obviously, the larger companies have much more complex supply chains and production footprints to think about. And so they're certainly, with large molecule, they've got a whole new series of things they've got to go think about. I think in the emerging to mid-sized company, it's really all about assets. Sometimes people, I do think we find some smaller companies that are looking to acquire not just the asset, but additional expertise and clinical skill sets.
I couldn't help but thinking about a local company here in the Research Triangle area focused in cell and gene therapy. I mean, they're a small little company. They raised a big Series A, I think, last year, and over $200 million, maybe Series B, but they raised, over $200 million, I believe. And they're a small, 50-person company, maybe even less. But you look at their M&A activity on the past 6, 7, 8 months. I mean, they've done maybe 8 deals or so, and not all of them have been acquisitions. Some of them have been licensing deals, but they're in the cell and gene therapy space. And I think what they're trying to do is create an end-to-end solution to where they don't have to outsource any of their manufacturing or production or anything like that. So I think one example, but that leads me to believe that some of this data is, I guess, subjective, is very dependent on where a company is, what stage they are, what they're looking to do. I think big pharma obviously doesn't need to expand from a global perspective, so that makes sense. They already have talent, so that makes sense. So that's low. Not much here for me, other than I think it's going to be very dependent based on where a particular company is in their development. It would be interesting to see a more robust data set on this.
Yeah. Tom or Dan, anything to add? I had a couple comments myself.
One thing that would be really interesting, we don't have the depth in the data to look at, is whether we're going to see a sea change based on gene and cell therapy, because as they come in, because that's really very different. It's very different how you have to interact, obviously, with the patient, the physician. It's a much more intimate relationship than, developing a pill or an injection. So looking at M&A and really all of these things as cell and gene therapy get moving, it will be a really interesting thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, Tom, that's a really good point. If you look back, 2018, there were $4 billion deals. 2019 got its start with around the same number of billion-dollar deals. To date, in 2020, a little slower start. However, I think consensus is that the energy is still there. And while we're starting off 2020 with not as many of these billion-dollar deals, I think we just heard the news this morning, a $5 billion deal. Gilead picked up 47, but I'm sure we'll round out the year netting the same, as it relates to the energy in the gene and cell therapy space.
You guys right in line with what I was thinking, that if this were a cut of data with companies that are in more of the new technologies around gene editing, gene and cell therapy, and you were to take a cut of those companies that are focused in those areas, would even the acquiring technology move up somewhat, but definitely the ability to look forward into what the challenges are that we already know exist around production of those types of products, which are very different in the way that you manage that production and have to manage those very specific products, but also manage the logistics of where those products are produced in relationship to where the patients are. So something of note that maybe in a later look at the survey, we can maybe tease that out somewhat. These panel discussions are brought to you by Kineticos Life Science and Worldwide Clinical Trials. I would ask everybody to join us next week for our fourth installment, when we'll discuss licensing activities and also CRO outsourcing. So until then, thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found this webinar thought-provoking. Like Philip mentioned, the discussions will continue, so please check back for the fourth webinar in the series. To learn more about Worldwide Clinical Trials, go to worldwide.com. For more information on Kineticos Life Sciences, please go to kineticos.com. Thank you.